Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this online launch of the latest report of the Mission Zero Coalition. The report is Building the Future, Lessons for a Buildings Breakthrough, and it's actually the fifth report that the Coalition has published since its formation almost a year ago. We're about to sort of celebrate our first anniversary. And for those of you who've been following the work of the coalition, its intention was to take the recommendations from the Net Zero Review, the Mission Zero report, and to pull out the 10 missions that were set out and to provide more finer grained detail about how to deliver those missions in the future. And we created several networks, one for each mission, and that included networks on local government, on power, and also on buildings. And we published our first buildings report in September 2023. That report, for those of you who've been following the coalition's work, was entitled Mission Retrofit. I felt at the time it wasn't possible to produce a single report that would do justice to all the work that is needed in the building sector, given the construction sector and the wider building sector represents one of the largest contributors to the UK's carbon dioxide emissions. And we decided at that time to focus our first report on existing buildings, given that they make up 80% of the UK's housing stock come 2050, and the absolute sort of priority to fast track retrofit, given that the UK is the poor man in Europe when it comes to insulation and low carbon heating. But today, we've now followed up with a second report. This now focuses specifically on new buildings. In particular, how do we create the building standards and the design standards that are needed to be able to ensure that the buildings we create today, that we construct today, won't need to be retrofitted. There is a huge challenge, but also an opportunity to ensure that the 300,000 homes that are built every single year, or supposed to be built every single year, won't be costing householders to retrofit them in the future. We have seen effectively a national scandal in the past 10 years where my own former government allowed 1.5 million homes, new homes, to be built that will have to be retrofitted at the cost of the householder. And how do we avoid this happening in the future is a key theme of today's report. The report focuses both inwards, looking at the UK, at what needs to happen from a domestic policy challenge, but also from an international challenge as well. The UK work, which I'll talk about in a moment, I'm delighted that we'll be joined today also by the report's co-author, Simon McWhirter, Deputy CEO of the UK Green Buildings Council, has highlighted that the insufficiencies of the future homes standard that the UK government has currently produced. And in fact, the consultation for that latest version of the standard closes tomorrow. So one part of the report is going to be a contribution to that sort of consultation, making specific, quite detailed recommendations about what the standard should contain, knowing that the standard simply isn't fit for a net zero purpose. And I'll be honest about that. It's not just that the actual specifications in the standard actually are beneath that of some homes that are being built already today. We can be far, far more ambitious in our approach, but also that the standard simply doesn't measure up to the new methodologies that are being advanced at pace and at scale around embodied carbon within the construction process, and also the life cycle analysis of buildings, and also the operational use of buildings as well. It's a vacuum that needs to be filled if we're going to ensure we have a net zero standard that's fit for purpose. But this week also marks a major conference that's taking place in Paris between the 6th and the 8th of March. And this is the first meeting of the buildings breakthrough that was announced at COP28. It's being led by the French and Moroccan government, and it has now Over 29 partner countries signed up to this buildings breakthrough, another 19 sort of key trade and industry organizations that will be helping to provide the work and research. And this breakthrough that was announced, as part of the wider breakthrough agenda that was created at COP26 in Glasgow, sets out how can we ensure that low emissions buildings, not quite net zero buildings, but low emissions buildings, are the new normal by 2030. And this is a huge challenge internationally, because at the moment, just 5% of all buildings internationally might be judged to be of a net zero standard. Only 35% of countries globally actually have any recognized quality buildings standards. And we're going to see potentially 3 billion new extra buildings required for a growing population. And this is why, for the UK, new buildings may not be important when it comes to the overall emissions reduction compared to existing buildings. It's actually the inverse when we look internationally, that 80% of buildings come 2050 globally will be new buildings. And so that challenge is to recognize that at the moment, our buildings emissions have been creeping up by 1% every single year since 2015. We've been going slightly backwards. Yet we also have a huge economic opportunity to be able to deliver low emissions homes that might be worth up to £1.8 trillion by 2030. And the rationale and the structure of this report is to suggest that if the UK can demonstrate leadership in new low carbon buildings, in setting net zero carbon building standards that are fit for purpose, it can help be a global leader to set the standard for the rest of the world and to ensure that everyone follows on the same path. We have a window of time now to ensure that through the buildings breakthrough, there is a consistency and a clarity of policy frameworks. What the Net Zero Review talked about around the 4 Cs, the consistency, the clarity, the continuity of ensuring that we have stable policy frameworks for the future, and that equally applies to the buildings breakthrough. I want to see the UK come forward knowing that we have recognised industry practices and institutions that are doing the work already. And that's another key part of this report, is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. That actually, just in the same way with renewable energy, we have the tools at hand, we have the frameworks at hand to get on with the job now. Equally, when it comes to looking at new buildings, we have potential design specifications, we have modern methods of construction, we have the opportunity to set out a net zero carbon buildings framework that is already under development. So in the report, we both go through the domestic situation of what's needed for the UK government to deliver leadership internationally. We then look also at what are the challenges and the synergies that are reflected in common themes that we've got to tackle as part of those global challenges. So again, looking at how we can finance new buildings, bringing in development capital. How do we ensure we've got the skills and the supply chain stacked up to be able to deliver these buildings in future? How do we ensure that the materials we use, the recyclable opportunities for a circular economy in steel, in other materials such as timber, or in low carbon materials such as concrete, it really it does come forward so that we have common standards and a common approach, and we can ensure that those supply chains expand rapidly and at pace. And the report sets out a policy framework of a new buildings delivery wheel to recognise that we've got to do all this at the same time. We've got to be able to recognise you can't just take one piece of the jigsaw forwards. We've got to be able to work across the whole landscape to deliver an ecosystem that reflects the life cycle analysis of the carbon dioxide emissions of a building, right from not just construction, but also the production of materials, all the way then through to the continued use of the building. And this wheel talks about securing, setting the regulatory and legislative conditions that are needed to underpin a new net zero buildings framework, then designing, so ensuring we have the research and development in place, we have the design codes in place to make sure that we are ensuring that the building sector is working towards a common framework, delivering in itself, implementing both standards and regulation and legislation, taking SMEs with us recognizing we have a fragmented supply chain and that we need to be working together at the same time as ensuring that we work with supply chains in industry and other materials, so they are also working towards a common framework. And then finally, verifying, the fourth part of the wheel, ensuring that having created standards, having created design codes, that we have the organizations and the people who are able to verify and hold to account what is needed for the future. And that's obviously a key omission in the Future Home Standard, where we've seen a critical part of the assessment process being at times voluntary. How do we ensure we have a mandatory process, and how do we ensure that we step up to and support that mandatory process, not just in the UK, but globally? And the report takes forwards 7 lessons for the Paris conference that's happening later this week. Again, as I said, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've got some great examples out there. What we need to do is end best practice. How do we create a uniform approach that ensures that best practice becomes the new normal, as the Buildings Breakthrough suggested in its ambition? So in terms of those lessons, the net zero carbon building standard is something we believe could be taken forwards at a global level. We encourage the Buildings Breakthrough to do so. We then have a lesson around how do we ensure that we can take forwards better sustainable finance frameworks. And for example, the Phoenix Group with their sustainable finance classification framework, we recommend as a potential existing framework that can be taken forwards as a lesson for the breakthrough. How do we research and how do we develop new technologies, new modern methods of design and construction for the future? We recommend that the Buildings Breakthrough looks at the Energy House 2.0 that Barratt's have developed alongside the University of Salford. I've been there myself, and a fantastic opportunity to then test in real time the heating of buildings, the cooling of buildings, and the buildings that have been designed using Energy House 2.0 have actually delivered energy bill costs of around £85 per month in comparison to, say, £315 per month for a Victorian home. So demonstrating the huge economic potential for savings for householders as well. Then there's the challenge around lessons of the reuse of material, of understanding how to create new sustainable materials. And 2 lessons that we've taken forwards in the report includes Timber Square, created by Landsec, and also Holbein Gardens, that have been taken forwards by Grosvenor. I'm delighted actually to be in Grosvenor's offices, and we'll have Andy Haig speak at the end of this session today. But the opportunity to recognise that new buildings don't necessarily have to be wholly new. You have the opportunity to recycle steel, to reduce the embodied carbon emissions of buildings, to be able to use new materials such as laminated timber, again, to reduce the overall life cycle emissions of those buildings. Highly innovative work, but we have some great examples in Landsec and Grosvenor of companies getting on with the job. And what we need to do is not just endlessly come up with new policy frameworks, but take this work and expand it at scale. Lesson number 6 was then to focus on the supply chain. How do we ensure that we can take all SMEs and partner supply chains with us at a time when not every company is a large construction company that has the capacity to do so. So we've been very much taken by NatWest's focus on setting up a supply chain sustainability school, ensuring that those lessons are shared, working with partner SMEs for the future, so that everyone works in tandem towards a common shared goal. And then finally, lesson 7 is around that assessment and verification process. We can create the standards, as I said, we can create those opportunities to deliver, but how do we hold organizations and companies account for the future? And that's why I'm delighted that we will also be joined later in this meeting today by Gilbert Lennox-King from Construction Carbon. Gilbert has worked alongside CIBSE as well to create a low carbon life cycle assessment process that's going to seek to train people to be able to assess against a certain net zero carbon building standards around the embodied and life cycle assessment of a building's emissions. And I think that's a critical point that we need to try to really highlight. Where do we go for the future if we're going to successfully deliver on new buildings? I'm now going to hand over to Simon McWhirter, Simon, as I said, Deputy CEO of UK Green Buildings Council, but Simon is obviously a co-author of the report. We're incredibly grateful for his work and support as co-chair of the Buildings Network of the Mission Zero Coalition. And Simon's going to give a bit more of a perspective from an industry perspective, and also what is needed both in the Future Home Standard and also with the Buildings Breakthrough event taking place in Paris later this week. Simon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. And just to echo, thanks to Mission Zero partner and UKGBC member Grosvenor for hosting us today. Looking at the names on the list, I think most of you will be, but for anyone not familiar with the UK Green Building Council, we're an industry-led member organisation with about 700 members across the supply chain and the value chain in the UK built environment sector. And our whole mandate and mission is around a radical transformation of the sustainability of the built environment here in the UK. And just to pick up on some of the points Chris has said first, if we get this right, driving best in class across the sector in the UK, the boons are many and varied. It drives down carbon, it drives down energy bills, addresses fuel poverty, and it gives us the opportunity to really create in the UK a powerhouse of innovation in clean tech and built environment spend to really improve the sector. And as a brilliant consequence, we get comfier, healthier homes and buildings to live, work and play in. But we've got to be realistic on the context here in this space. So, for anyone who's not seen the Guardian report today, UK's low carbon spend over the last 3 years is about half of what has been spent across France and about a third of what's been spent in Germany or Italy. So we're way behind the track in really taking this issue seriously and doubling down on it, both in a public and private sector investment sense. And when we look at the carbon piece, remembering that roughly speaking, if we take a whole life carbon view of things, the built environment is responsible for 25% of the carbon impact across the UK. Chris mentioned the fact that about 80% of our homes and buildings that are going to be here in 2050 have already been built. But that does obviously mean that 20% have not yet been built. And what's really important is that we don't continuing to build those buildings that are going to be the retrofits of the future. We need to get it right now by putting in place the right mechanisms to deliver in an improved way. And I guess just thinking about things from a more holistic environmental perspective, we live in a resource-constrained world, and it's important that we're constantly making intelligent and sometimes difficult decisions about not just what we build and how we build it, but whether we build, and really focusing back in on where we can repurpose, renovate, upgrade, and improve. But the underlying tenet is the World Bank has said that 3 billion people will need new housing by 2030. So there's a big challenge to make sure that we're getting that right in a low carbon direction. And I would just double down on the core point in the report that clarity and consistency is key here when we're looking at the delivery of our new homes and buildings. And that's clarity for the long term. We need to be looking at long-term, predictable, secure and stable regulation, the finance flows that feed that, and then the delivery as well. Keeping that consistency is key. So when last autumn we had the green policy rollback by the current government, that sent shockwaves through the investment community and the delivery community, because that comfort and confidence to act in this space was gone and damaged. Unfortunately, the Labour Party policy commitments have shifted in the same negative direction earlier this calendar year. Whoever is the next government, they're not really putting a lot of progressive thinking and ambition into the policy space at the moment. And I come back to the fact that industry genuinely welcomes good regulation, provided they can trust that that regulation is being put in place for long term and is going to be stuck to. And that gives the trust in the sector to give them that investment confidence. But unfortunately, what we saw put out to market as the consultation and the Future Homes and Building Standard, and I had a small bit of my career as a journalist, and we trot out these hackneyed phrases like once in a lifetime opportunity. But just because of what that Future Homes and Building Standard is supposed to do, it's going to set the tone for decades of what we build and how we build it and what we build it from. So it was very disheartening to see the complete lack of ambition there. And after what happened with the green policy rollback in the autumn, this was a real chance later last year for UK government to claw back some of the global leadership position around green progressive thinking in this policy space. For those of us a bit long in the tooth here, we're all quite nervy. This feels a little bit like when the plug got pulled in 2015 around zero carbon homes. And what was shown back then and what we would hope to show now is through the AMC4 project, you know, once people got their head around it, research and development and investment money flowed enormously into the sector and into the innovation space here. And over the period from 2012 to 2015, the cost of delivering to a really progressive code level 4 at the time, that cost halved. So it shows that industry mobilizes around that good regulation, but the long-term confidence piece is key. The Future Homes Hub did a really good piece of work in this space, looking at the sort of potential for housing standards as we move forward. And it was a sterling piece of work that set out a spectrum of options as to how we could move forward. That spectrum ranged from the woefully inadequate at one end of the spine of what new homes could be, through to a very, very progressive set of thinking of very high environmental performance standards. Unfortunately, with the consultation has come out, government has run with the weakest 2 of the 5 options in that consultation. So the bottom of those is a genuinely retrograde step. And actually thousands of homes are already being delivered in the UK way ahead of that supposedly future-looking standard. And actually, if we delivered properties to that standard, people's bills would go up compared to current regulation. So, you know, it's an absolute misnomer to think that what's been put forward in that consultation is a future home standard at all. There's a lot of very specific challenges around what's being proposed that we'll probably come to in the Q&A, but it's still not looking properly at real energy and use of those homes in terms of what is the actual performance in the real world and what is the energy, carbon, environmental impact of those properties. I guess at UKGBC, we've been looking very hard at this and working across our membership base, those 700 members across the sector. And we set a 5 key tests for that future home standard, saying, you know, what do we think is required in there for it to be deemed a truly successful position to take us forward? So for instance, let's build to fabric standards. That means we don't have to go back in and retrofit these homes again before 2050. If you look at the combined renewable and fabric costs, it's 5 times more expensive for people to get the standards to the near net zero level later on than it is to do it at design and build stage. So that's basically pushing that cost from the developer to the householder over time. We need to be making properties that are much more responsive to the grid and not allowing smart, intelligent energy movement between buildings, storage, and the grid itself. And as we're going to make the grid take increasingly heavy loads at the decarbonisation front, we need to make sure that our buildings can act as nodes at the end of the grid and enable that smart energy movement. Unfortunately, despite the fact there is work going on elsewhere, and Gilbert will talk to this issue more, I'm sure, but whole life carbon isn't being taken in a holistic sense. So we're not looking at the embodied carbon impacts through this future home standard consultation. And lastly, it's not a standard that looks to the fact that we have a future much warmer climate coming down the line, and therefore our homes need to be much more adaptable and resilient to that warmer climate. The Committee for Climate Change pointed out that this is an area of real delinquency across the UK in terms of how we're adapting generally and specifically within our buildings to that future warmer climate. So it's something that we really have to do. I've just focused and chunky elements of today's conversation will inevitably focus on homes, but just worth saying this consultation that's out is obviously future homes and building standard, and many of the concerns parallel into the non-domestic and commercial building space. And unfortunately, progress there has been really glacial over recent years. And the same issues are really key here about clarity of the long-term direction and speed of the regulation in terms of improving environmental standards in our new commercial buildings. And that's about signposting when that regulation is coming into place, setting limits around the performance of those new commercial buildings, and then over time ratcheting that. So making it clear and understandable to building owners, occupiers, and delivery agencies that the standards are going to get tougher, and these are the points they're going to get tougher at, and therefore be prepared. And that whole process around signposting, informing, and giving people the tools and confidence to get ready for those things, again, is absent in that commercial space. And specifically within the commercial building space, as we look at the delivery of new buildings, government really needs to lead here with its public estate in a much more ambitious way than it has been. And actually, across both new and existing buildings. Government really need to set the example here about only occupying buildings with performance above certain levels, for instance. And if we look at the example coming from New South Wales and Australia with the Neighbour scheme, it was those sorts of commitments by regional governments across Australia that really drove the uptake and improvement in standards across the commercial building stock by that sort of public sector lead in the space. So I will pause there and hand over to Gilbert, I believe, and look forward to the questions. And thanks. There's 144 of you all now, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon, and good morning, everyone. My name is Gilbert Lennox-King from made available for all participants in the industry. But we believe that we'll only get there with collaboration with the industry, and that to be accessible to smaller companies, the latest technology needs to be developed and used. Construction Carbon was founded to tackle the construction industry's hidden emissions, embodied carbon from material manufacture, transport, and assembly. Even though these emissions account for as much as 11% of global emissions, this has historically been a neglected area. And the problem is that real estate developers rarely have control over their portfolio's carbon emissions. This is down to three factors. Firstly, there's poor industry understanding, meaning high carbon projects are still being delivered. We have inconsistent assessments, meaning comparison is difficult. And as a result, there's little or no reporting, bringing with it a risk that the desired decarbonisation trajectories are not met. In relation to the Building the Future report, while it is essential that a common standard for low carbon and net zero buildings be adopted, we believe it's equally important that this standard is enforced consistently and effectively verified if it is to be fit for purpose. To this end, we've been working hard with industry partners to help align definitions, for example, the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard and building capacity and training programs. So why is training important? To improve the quality and accessibility of carbon assessments. We've developed a two-part life cycle assessment training program alongside leading experts and delivered with the Supply Chain Sustainability School. The foundation level training is free to attend for anyone looking to build capacity in this area or any property professionals. And a second, more in-depth and formally accredited training is currently under development with delivery partners, the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, and will be released in the autumn. So why accreditation? Well, we believe training is a foundation for change because without a formal accreditation, the foundation of the life cycle assessment can shift, making policy ineffective. With common standards and a consistent picture of the truth, policy, financial incentives, and reporting is achievable. We need to be able to compare apples with apples. Why would you report performance of your building? Because if we can have an ecosystem of accredited assessors, developers can report at every stage of the building life cycle. What ultimately gets measured gets managed, data quality improves, and we can meet our decarbonisation trajectories. We're seeing a huge wave of new products trying to smooth this process of delivering life cycle assessments and data collection at all stages of the building life cycle, from early stage low carbon option analysis tools to automatic life cycle assessments taken from the design drawings, to assigning carbon factors to cost plans and more accurate energy modeling tools, and data collection tools to collect data from the site in more efficient ways. This is all happening whilst the wave of generative AI is evolving at a rapid and breakneck speed. And the team at the UK Green Building Council are doing amazing work in this area with their Innovative Startup Forum, which links up suppliers of new technology with buyers of the latest innovative developments. So in conclusion, we believe a simple path to net zero for construction can be made available for all participants in the industry. We believe that we'll only get there with collaboration with the industry. And we believe that to be accessible to the whole industry, common standards, training, and the latest technology needs to be developed and used. This path is possible and will require massive effort from the entire industry, but it is achievable. And if the UK can grasp this opportunity, we can effect change, not just here, but globally. So now I'd like to hand back to Chris Skidmore to go through some of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Chris. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining for today's report launch. As Chris said, Grosvenor are proud to be members of the Mission Zero Buildings Network and support today's launch. Many of the challenges that our sector faces are well known and already discussed today, and our sector must change, and the speed and scale of that change is unprecedented. And I just wanted to focus on a couple of comments raised earlier, because we seem to have been talking about many of these changes for many years, and what do we all need to do to achieve real change this time, as being mentioned. I think one of the issues is the challenges cannot be addressed in isolation. As individuals and individual organisations, we cannot tackle these problems alone. We need partnerships. We need partnerships across organisations, and we need public and private partnerships. And I think that's why this Mission Zero coalition is so invaluable, because the coalition is focused on tackling these knotty problems and shining a light on what is needed, and bringing together partners from across the sector and unpicking which policy asks are required to facilitate change. And as Andy Ford asked, how do we ensure long-term cross-party political ambition? And again, I think this is where the coalition is kind of so fundamental, because they have been engaging across major political parties. And Grosvenor has actually taken some of the asks from the previous reports and talked both to local and national politicians across both, across the party divide. So party politics should be agnostic, and the coalition is very useful in helping to ensure that all corporates and everyone on this call can have the same asks of government. But ultimately, today's report is just words on a page. It is up to us on this call to digest the report, the lessons learnt, and the policy asks within it. It is up to us to consider which policy asks most closely align to our corporate and personal beliefs, and then champion these within our companies, and both at a national and local government. So essentially, this is a bit of a call to arms that is up to us to be the change makers. We need to be responsible for taking forward the ambitions set out in today's report.
Well, thank you, Andy, for that. And we look forward to working with Grosvenor again in the future. It's been a fantastic opportunity to take forwards and socialise some of the recommendations of the Net Zero Review and to look in further detail as what's needed. I'd like to thank again Gilbert Lennox-King and also Simon McWhirter for their support in the launch today. Wish Gilbert all the best with construction carbon and the low carbon life cycle assessment process that he's taking forwards. And I'll be in Paris also with Simon. We're actually going to head off to Future Build Excel now to physically then publicise the launch of this report. So you had an exclusive taster this morning, and then both Simon and myself, as part of the Mission Zero Coalition, but obviously the UK Green Buildings Council, will be in Paris making the case for some of the recommendations you've heard today. I'd also just quite like to thank, in conclusion, Grace Girling, who Grace has taken forwards the research and the writing of a large part of this report. Extremely grateful for her help and support, and also Max Austin, the director of the Mission Zero Coalition, for helping to pull everything together. So thank you to the Mission Zero Coalition team. Thanks to all the contributors today. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to future events and hope you will join those also. Hope you have a good rest of the day.